At 4:57 p.m. on April 3, 2022, a woman called 911 from a luxury high-rise apartment in Miami's Edgewater neighborhood. On the recording, a man can be heard saying he's dying, that he's losing feeling in his arm. The woman on the phone tells him, "I'm sorry, baby." 7 minutes later, police arrived to find her kneeling in a spreading pool of blood, cradling him in her arms. She told them she'd thrown a kitchen knife at him from 10 feet away to protect herself. The medical examiner would later find that explanation almost impossible to square with what the knife had actually done to his body. This is the story of Christian Obumseli and the 4-year legal battle over whether the woman he loved killed him in self-defense, or got away with calling it that for far longer than the evidence should have allowed. Welcome back to AMC True Crime. Today we're covering one of the most heavily litigated, most publicly dissected domestic violence homicide cases of the last decade. A case that took over 4 years to reach any kind of resolution, involved a set of parents arrested for evidence tampering, and ended not with a murder conviction, but with a plea deal that has left a grieving family saying it brings them only partial peace. This is the story of Christian Obumseli and of Courtney Clenney, the OnlyFans model known online as Courtney Tailor, who admitted, 4 years later, to causing the wound that killed him. Before this case became a headline about OnlyFans and true crime YouTube channels and courtroom drama, Christian Obumseli was a 27-year-old man with a name his family says most of the world stopped hearing after his death. He went by Toby to people close to him. His middle name was Tobechukwu. He'd grown up with ties to Plano, Texas, before eventually settling in Miami. Professionally, he worked as a cryptocurrency trader at a moment when that world was full of young men chasing exactly the kind of fast, glamorous success that seemed to match the life he and Courtney were living together. Designer trips, ocean view apartments, a couple that looked, from the outside, like they had everything. His mother, Chio Obumseli, would later describe him in a single sentence that she repeated, almost like a plea, throughout the years of court proceedings that followed his death, that he was kind-hearted, compassionate, friendly, and respectful, that he cared about other people. She has said, more than once, that she does not want her son remembered only for the way he died, that there was a whole person before there was a case file. By early 2022, Christian and Courtney had been together for roughly 2 years. Miami-Dade prosecutors would later describe their relationship in blunt terms: extremely tempestuous and combative, not a slow burn, not a relationship with one bad year, a relationship that, by all outside accounts, ran hot in both directions, constantly, and that the people around them increasingly worried about. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the warning signs weren't hidden, they were on video. Months before Christian's death, footage surfaced, later obtained and aired by NBC6, appearing to show Courtney hitting him. Around the same time, during a trip to Aspen, Colorado, in February 2022, witnesses on the trip told reporters they saw Christian return with a fresh stitched wound on his face that he didn't explain, and photos from the same trip show visible injuries on Courtney as well: taped knuckles, a bloodied elbow. Friends on that trip said they didn't ask questions in the moment. They just noticed something had happened. This is the part of the case that would take on outsized importance 2 years later, once video evidence became central to how prosecutors framed the relationship, not as one violent night, but as what the state attorney would eventually call a pattern of escalating violence. But in the moment, in early 2022, none of that had reached the level of an arrest. It reached the level of gossip, of concerned friends, of a couple that fought loudly enough that neighbors in their building were reportedly pushing for their eviction. Then came the weekend that ended it. On April 1st, 2022, 2 days before Christian died, police were called to their apartment complex for a domestic disturbance. According to the account that later became public, Courtney had kicked Christian out of the apartment, and when he tried to follow her into the elevator, she asked responding officers for a restraining order, telling them he was stalking her. He left. Then he came back, And by all appearances, the two of them patched things up, at least enough that 2 days later, according to the state attorney's timeline, the day began peacefully. The couple was playing with their dogs. Then, on the afternoon of April 3rd, something shifted. At 4:43 p.m., Courtney called her mother. She called again 6 minutes later, at 4:49. Her mother would later tell investigators she could hear shouting on the line, her daughter telling Christian to leave the apartment. At 4:57 p.m., Courtney called 911. Police arrived at 5:04 p.m., 7 minutes after that call, and found her drenched in blood, with Christian curled on the floor, still alive. Paramedics arrived, and he was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital's Ryder Trauma Center. He did not survive. On the 911 recording, Christian can be heard telling the dispatcher he was dying, that he was losing feeling in his arm. Courtney is heard on the same call, saying, "I'm sorry, baby." At 5:25 p.m., while all of this was still unfolding, Courtney's mother sent her a text message. It mentioned the words, "self-defense," and told her not to say anything to investigators without a lawyer present. When police interviewed Courtney, she told them she had grabbed a kitchen knife during the argument and warned Christian, "Don't come anywhere close to me," insisting she had no intention of using it. Her account, and the account her legal team would build the next several years of defense around, was that she threw the knife from roughly 10 feet away in self-defense, and that it struck him by chance. The medical examiner's findings told a different story. The knife hadn't grazed him or caught him at a glancing angle the way a thrown blade tends to. It had gone in 3.5 inches, directly into his chest, severing his subclavian artery, one of the major blood vessels running beneath the collarbone. To the state's forensic experts, that kind of wound depth and placement was far more consistent with a knife driven at close range than one thrown across a room. It's worth pausing on why that distinction mattered so much to this case. If the physical evidence didn't support the version of events at the center of her self-defense claim, then the story she gave police in the immediate aftermath, the one her mother had already, in real time, started coaching her toward, was in serious trouble before Courtney had even finished telling it. And yet, remarkably, it would take investigators over 4 months to file charges. Courtney Clenney was not arrested at the scene, and she was not arrested in the days immediately following Christian's death. Instead, she left Florida. By August, she was on the Big Island of Hawaii, where, according to her attorney at the time, she was receiving treatment for PTSD and substance abuse. On August 10, 2022, the U.S. Marshals Service, working with Hawaii police, arrested her there. She was extradited back to Florida and booked into the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center in Miami, denied bond. At a press conference announcing the charge, Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle stood alongside Christian's brother and cousin and delivered the line that would come to define the state's entire case, that this violent, toxic relationship did not have to end with Christian's murder, that he was a victim of domestic violence, not the aggressor prosecutors say Courtney's defense was trying to paint him as. On August 31, 2022, Courtney pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder through her attorney, Frank Prieto. She wasn't present for the hearing. It lasted about 2 minutes. She would remain in custody, without bond, for the next 4 years. If this had simply been a self-defense claim tested against a single autopsy report, the case might have moved quickly. It didn't, because the deeper investigators and both legal teams dug, the more the case expanded far beyond the afternoon of April 3rd. Throughout 2023 and into 2024, more video surfaced. Footage from the months before Christian's death, including body camera footage and cell phone video obtained by NBC6, appeared to show Courtney as the aggressor in earlier physical altercations between the couple, not the victim. One clip, filmed by a colleague on the Aspen trip, ran roughly 3 minutes and showed her attacking Christian. This was the opposite of the narrative her defense had been building, and prosecutors leaned into it directly, describing what jurors would eventually have seen as a documented pattern, not an isolated act of self-defense. Then, in January 2024, the case took a turn almost nobody was expecting. Courtney's own parents were arrested. Kim and Deborah Clenney, her father and mother, were taken into custody in Austin, Texas, on Florida warrants. The allegation was that after police released the crime scene back to the family following the initial investigation, Christian's laptop, which had been left behind and never seized as evidence, was removed from the apartment by Courtney's father, and that her parents had then illegally accessed it. Investigators treated it as a potential evidence-tampering and computer crimes case, layered directly on top of the murder prosecution against their daughter. That side case eventually collapsed. A judge found that prosecutors had improperly accessed material protected by attorney-client privilege while building it, and the computer-related charges against both Courtney and her parents were dropped. Her defense team then went further, asking the court to remove the entire Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office from the case, arguing that after everything, the parents' arrest, the years of pretrial publicity, the videos, Courtney could no longer receive a fair trial in that jurisdiction. The state opposed the motion, and the case continued to grind forward, year after year, toward a trial date that kept moving. By the summer of 2026, more than 4 years after Christian died, that trial was finally scheduled to begin within weeks. It never happened. At the end of July 2026, Courtney's attorneys confirmed that a plea agreement had been reached, though the exact terms weren't made public yet. A hearing was set for August 10th before Miami-Dade Judge Andrea Ricker-Wolfson, who would decide whether to formally accept it. On the morning of August 10th, 2026, Courtney Clenney, now 30 years old, wearing an orange jail uniform after 4 years in custody, stood in a Miami courtroom and pleaded guilty, not to second-degree murder, which was the charge she'd faced since 2022, and which could have carried up to 30 years in prison. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter with a deadly weapon, formally admitting that she was the one who caused the stab wound that killed Christian Obumseli. Under the terms of the deal, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison, with credit for the 4 years she'd already spent in custody awaiting trial. That will be followed by 5 years of probation. She's required to undergo both a mental health evaluation and treatment, and a substance abuse evaluation and treatment. She is barred from financially benefiting from the case in any way going forward. Her attorneys estimate that, accounting for time served, she'll spend somewhere between roughly 18 and 20 more months behind bars before her release. Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez-Rundle released a statement afterward, saying the agreement had been reached in full consultation with, and with the approval of, Christian's family, and that her office's prosecutors had remained focused throughout on what they described as core evidence that Courtney stabbed Christian as part of a pattern of escalating violence toward him. She said she hoped the plea brought the family a measure of justice that had, in her words, been too long denied. In the courtroom that day, Christian's mother, Christian Obumseli, stood and spoke directly. What she said cuts through everything else about this case: the videos, the legal maneuvering, the years of delay. She told the court that nothing can describe what it feels like for a mother to stand at her child's grave. She spoke about the things that will never happen now: birthdays that won't be celebrated, holidays that won't be shared, conversations that will never be had, the person Christian would have continued becoming if he'd been allowed to keep living. She said those losses don't end when a court case does. They keep going long after. Courtney reportedly remained composed through most of the hearing, but broke down while Christian's mother was speaking. On the defense side, attorney Frank Prieto called the plea a common-sense decision, one that finally gave the case an endpoint after more than 4 years without one. Courtney's father, Kim Clenney, spoke to reporters afterward as well, saying that what mattered to him now was that his daughter finally had a future ahead of her, that he was looking forward to the day he could sit across from her again, face to face. The attorney representing Christian's family, Larry Handfield, put out a statement of his own in the days leading up to the hearing, that Courtney pleading guilty and accepting full responsibility would begin the process of bringing closure to what he called a very tragic, life-changing event for the Obumseli family. Christian Obumseli said something similar in her own words, that more than 4 years of grief don't simply close because a legal chapter does, that no sentence, no plea can bring her son back, that her only hope now is to carry his memory forward and keep healing as a family. Christian Obumseli was 27 years old. He was a son, a brother, a partner in a relationship that everyone around him, and eventually the state of Florida, came to see very differently than it might have looked from the outside in early 2022. His mother has spent 4 years trying to make sure the world remembers more about him than the manner of his death, that he was kind-hearted, that he was compassionate, that he cared about other people. Courtney Clenney will serve roughly 2 more years for the manslaughter of the man she once called baby while he was dying in her arms. Whether that sentence feels like justice depends entirely on who you ask, and this case, more than most, has never offered anyone a simple answer to that question. May Christian Obumseli rest in peace. If this case affected you, and you're in a relationship where you feel unsafe, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. If you want more cases covered with this level of depth, subscribe to AMC True Crime and let us know in the comments which case you want us to dig into next.